The Prime Minister today backed Donald Trump's decision to bomb Iran's nuclear sites.
The world has long agreed that Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon, and we support action to prevent that, and that is what this is. The US action was directed at specific sites central to Iran's nuclear program. We don't want escalation and a full-scale war.
But he wasn't weighing in on the debate over whether this US action is in breach of international law, nor would the Prime Minister confirm whether Australia provided any intelligence support for this mission, only saying it was a unilateral action by the United States. Mike Pezzullo is the former Secretary of Home Affairs and a former Deputy Secretary of the Defence Department. He's also the author of the 2009 Defence White Paper. Mike Pezzullo, welcome to the program.
Good evening, David.
Is it possible, in your view, that Australia provided any support for this mission?
David, it's not clear from the outside, and I agree with the Prime Minister that we should be very cautious about discussing intelligence or related matters. But as a matter of policy principle, it's been the long-standing policy of successive governments going right back to the Whitlam government in the early 1970s that the hosting of certain facilities here, principally Northwest Cape, which is a submarine communications facility near the town of Exmouth in WA, and of course Pine Gap, which is near Alice Springs, would be the subject of joint control, Australia's full knowledge of all activities, and our concurrence, and that's the phrase that's been standing policy since Gough Whitlam used that term in relation to Northwest Cape, and then Bob Hawke, very seminal policy announcement in 1988, put the umbrella concept of concurrence across all of those facilities. So it's hard to say from the outside, but you'd have to think that to the extent the Americans had a pre-existing, if you will, concurrence from the Australian government to use those facilities for whatever purposes they deem necessary, it is possible, but I just wouldn't care to speculate.
But when the Prime Minister says this was a unilateral US action, in your experience, does that mean those facilities, Pine Gap and Northwest Cape, weren't used?
David, to fully answer that question, I'd have to breach my obligations of lifelong secrecy and
we don't want you to do that, fair enough.
No, but what I can say is there's probably less scope. If you just look at a map or a chart of the world, the planes couldn't go north because that would take them over Russian airspace, and that would be a whole different discussion. They feinted or decoyed to the west, but they went east. So on that direction of travel, there's the likelihood of lesser potential Australian involvement, but beyond that, I just wouldn't want to speculate.
Look, more broadly, you've been arguing for greater transparency around how Australia's facilities, its bases as well, and other assets are used by the United States. And certainly we are seeing this cooperation expand, and AUKUS will take it to a new level. Is it clear to you, as someone who spent decades in defence and home affairs, is it clear exactly what the US does and doesn't have permission to do when it comes to these Australian assets?
Yes, in relation to one category, and unfortunately, as I wrote on the weekend, no in relation to another category. So let me just quickly unpack that. In relation to those facilities that I've already mentioned, Northwest Cape, there was a ground station at Narunga near Woomera that was transferred, its functions were transferred to Alice Springs in 1999, and in Alice Springs itself, Australia has very deep, because I was in part, I can answer that because I was responsible for the policy function in defence. We have very deep knowledge of the functions and the general uses to which they are put. And that policy Whitlam proclaimed in relation to Northwest Cape that I've already mentioned, 1974, and in 1988, Hawke reached an agreement with the Reagan administration that we would generalise that policy of concurrence across all of these facilities. Up until the agreement by the Gillard government in 2011, it was also long-standing policy that no foreign forces, US or otherwise, would be stationed in Australia. And stationed, I would argue for this purpose, should include rotation or being able to fly through into pre-positioned fuel dumps, pre-positioned stores, extended runways.
So what changes with this moment?
With that set of initiatives that the Gillard government first agreed with the Obama administration, which the Abbott government then put into treaty form in 2014, they're called the US Force Posture Initiatives. And that allows the American government, the US administration, to build up not so much its forces, because very few of them are here, although that'll change soon, particularly with the arrival of 4 attack submarines going into HMAS Sterling. But it allows them to extend runways, build fuel dumps, build a whole lot of underlying infrastructure. My contention, as I argued on the weekend, is that is completely different. It's different in quality and different in a matter of principle, because that's providing physical support to combat operations, and that could include things like refuelling bombers, for instance.
And are you saying this is unclear what role Australia has in saying yes or no to missions activities using those bases?
No, I'm saying it's very clear from the public record that what's happened is that they've transplanted the old Whitlam-Hawke formula of full knowledge and concurrence, and all governments since Mr Abbott signed that treaty in 2014 have said we'll retrofit that, or we'll fit that across.
And is that enough?
No. Australia should have a say, a decisive say, an active say. So think of it in these terms, David. If you do something which I maybe agree with, don't agree with, but we're close and I say, David, I've concurred in what you did, but you didn't ask me for permission and nor did I give it to you, that's concurrence. It's a soft form of agreement. If, however, you're going to do something more dramatic that might affect my interests, like you want to do something at my house, I would expect you to ask me, and I'd expect you to hold off until I agreed.
So just to be clear on this, are you saying the US could launch missions from Australian soil and Australia does not have the permission to say no?
In order to say no, you need what NATO has, which is a warfighting alliance structure where you pre-agree plans. So if you look at NATO, 32 members, they're having their summit in the next couple of days. They have military planning processes which deal with classified plans, which we don't need to get into the detail of. For instance, to do with how would NATO defend Poland, let's say. How would 31 other countries rush to Poland's defence if they are attacked from Russia? All those countries have to pre-agree that, yes, you can drive through my autobahns in Germany, for instance.
Okay.
Unless that's transpired and it just simply hasn't been made public to the Australian people, then we have to fall back on those older arrangements, which are that
you're
softer
arguing
form
are not adequate.
of
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's that softer form of concurrence, which is not agreement.
Okay, that's very interesting. I want to come back to the situation with Iran. Much debate over whether this US strike was legal or not. You're not an international law expert, nor am I. But I do want to ask you whether this now sets a new precedent, as some have said, of might is right. Can a big power now launch a preemptive strike on a smaller power on the grounds that it's acting in self-defence?
Well, this goes to the nub of the efforts, for instance, to convince George Bush, Bush 43 that is, to go to the UN, for instance, to seek cover for some of the military operations that occurred after 9/11. What the Trump administration has said, and I've not seen any statements of international policy, legal positioning by the US government, but as I understood what the US permanent representative in New York said, we acted in accordance with, and she used a very particular phrase, as did the Secretary of Defence last night in that grab you showed, we acted in relation to collective self-defence. That, to my mind, means that they're relying on Article 51 of the UN Charter, which allows nations to act in accordance with their inherent right of defence, self-defence both of themselves and collectively of others.
All right. Just because we're tight on time, I also want to get your thoughts on what sort of retaliation you're worried about as a former head of Home Affairs, particularly in the Australian context. What should we be concerned about when it comes to potential Iranian retaliation?
I've got no doubt, just given their track record and the public statements that have been made in the past by the FBI, by the head of MI5 and others, that Tony Burke and his department, and I congratulate the government on reconstituting Home Affairs in its full apparatus after the last election. Tony Burke, his secretary, and critically the counter-terrorism coordinator in Home Affairs would be working overtime with border agencies, the investigative agencies and others to ensure that we're completely locked down, that any sense that there might be a risk arising from sleeper cells, sabotage, assassination are dealt with as best they can. Remember, David, and I'll just use one quick example, in 1994, Iran masterminded an attack on a Jewish cultural centre in Buenos Aires in 94. 85 people died in that attack. No one's ever been brought to justice. The Argentinian government have been trying to get Iranian operatives to their courts. That's the sort of thing they can do. The other thing that I'm really concerned about, and you've heard lots through the day about Straits of Hormuz, strikes on US bases, etc. The other one that hasn't been much talked about, and we shouldn't sensationalise this, but if any of that enriched uranium at whatever grade of enrichment has been secreted out of those facilities, particularly Fordo, is made available for the construction of a dirty bomb, in other words, a radiological dispersal device that doesn't explode with nuclear explosive effect but can spread dangerous radiological harm over a wide area that gives you cancer and you die over a slow and painful death. I'd be really worried that, particularly if the regime starts to fracture and a more militant sub-faction decides we're not going to accommodate, we're not going to surrender, let's do something involving, say, a dirty bomb.
Mike Pezzullo, on that concerning note, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David.